Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I guess it's afternoon everywhere. I'm Michael Waldman. Uh, I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this Brennan Center for Justice live event. We are very excited to have this conversation about this fraught moment in our country and its history, about this harrowing presidential transition, what we can learn from the past and from other presidential transitions, and what our challenges are right now today as a country going forward. For those of you who don't know the Brennan Center, we are a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We work to strengthen and improve the systems of democracy and justice in the United States. We're affiliated with NYU School of Law. We do not support candidates in elections. We work, among other things, to defend the Constitution and our system of self-government, and what a moment for that. As you all know, as we all know, we are living in an extraordinary moment for our country. A time when we have been going through, for the past year, a grave public health crisis, costing the lives of so many whom we love. We've had a reckoning with racial injustice, with centuries of racial injustice playing out on the streets of our country to this very day. And we've had a presidential election and its aftermath, unlike just about any we've ever had. Start, I would suggest, by understanding what a remarkable achievement the 2020 election was for our country. Despite the pandemic, and despite voter suppression, and despite the lies about the election, it was the highest turnout since 1900. That's extraordinary. There was a real achievement of hundreds of thousands of people who worked to make the election free and fair and safe and secure. And it was also extraordinary that in this context that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris received the highest share of the popular vote of any presidential challenger since 1932. They won handily. And that victory, of course, as we know, has been confirmed over and over and over again in counts and recounts across the country. And then, of course, there's been the extraordinary, disheartening, and deeply significant period since the election. This transition was not just about GSA and who it gave access to or getting ready for an inaugural parade. We know that from the very first, President Trump, lied about the election, claimed he had been victorious in a landslide, that there was massive fraud over weeks and weeks, convincing up to 70% or more of his own supporters that the election had been stolen at various points, that his challenges to the election were repudiated over and over again by the federal government, which said this was the most secure election in memory, by the Justice Department, and by 60 court rulings, all culminating, as we all know, in the shocking and outrageous events of last week. An insurrection at the Capitol, egged on by the President of the United States, a white nationalist mob storming the Capitol to stop the counting of the people's votes. It still sears our memories, and plainly will be one of the signal moments of our time, and something that the new administration in the country will have to deal with going forward. And now we're all talking a few days from a time when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will take the oath on that west front of the Capitol, in a Capitol building, an area surrounded by what's basically a division of troops. It's an extraordinary moment, and we have a lot to learn from the past, from other transitions, even as we recognize this is not just something from history, but history being made today. I don't know if you've all seen on Twitter and the internet, one of the widely circulated points is someone said AP history teachers are going to have quite a time with this in years to come. So we can begin that first rough draft of history today. We're very fortunate to be joined by three compelling and learned voices that can help us make sense of this moment. First, Jonathan Alter is an award-winning historian and columnist and documentary filmmaker. an MSNBC political analyst. He is relevant in particular to this conversation, the author of the book, The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope, two books about the Obama presidency, including the beginning of his term, and most recently, the very first full-length biography of Jimmy Carter and his President Jimmy Carter, his very best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. We're really glad to have John here. Donna Edwards is no stranger to all of you, and certainly no stranger to those who follow the Brennan Center. She's a former member of Congress. She represented Maryland's 4th District from 2008 to 2017. She is a Washington Post contributing columnist. She provides regular political commentary on NBC, on MSNBC, and Fox News. She's a wonderful writer, most recently in the last few days, a really tremendous article I encourage folks to look at about her trip across America during the last presidential inaugural. And Donna, we're really glad to have you here. And Ted Widmer. Ted is distinguished lecturer at Macaulay Honors College at CUNY. In addition to his teaching, he's written numerous books about American history and the presidency, writes for the New York Times, for the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and other publications. And his most recent book, also highly relevant to this fraught moment, is Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington, about the transition in 1861 and what Abraham Lincoln faced as the country broke apart during that fraught time. All three are old friends of mine, and I'm really honored on behalf of my colleagues at the Brennan Center to welcome all of you. And I would like to start, before we turn the clock back to learn the lessons of history, I'd like to start by asking what you think briefly is at stake in this moment for all of us in our country. And why don't I start with you, Donna?
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to the Brennan Center for Justice. Look, I think that, over these last several weeks, and not just last week, we have seen how fragile democracy is and our institutions. And we've also seen important voices stepping forward in defense of democracy. And I think that that has actually been quite refreshing. It tells us that, in fact, that we are resilient, but it's going to take a lot of work, not just from elected officials upholding our institutions, but from all of us as citizens.
Thank you. Ted Widmer, what do you think is at stake as we end 2020 and begin 2021?
Well, I think it's important to know we have unspoken rules as well as spoken ones. We have a clearly written constitution, but we keep learning that the constitution needs to be adapted to new realities every generation. And certain things the founders took for granted are no longer taken for granted, including the spirit of fair play, the spirit of accepting the result of an election, the spirit of telling the truth as you are giving speeches. All of that was too obvious for them to even put into the Constitution. But we've seen just how fragile those basic tenets of decency are. And we would all be appalled if we were watching a football game or a baseball or basketball game and the game seemed to end and then the other side just decided it hadn't lost and wanted to keep playing. We have to abide by the unspoken rules as well as the spoken ones. So I'm delighted to be with you, Michael, and the great work the Brennan Center does, and Dale and Jonathan, and Donna and Jonathan, and just to get at what decency is. That's at the heart of the democracy Donna was just talking about.
Thank you, Ted. John, what do you see as being at stake at this moment?
Well, thanks to you and the Brennan Center for doing this. I think that what's at stake is this a break in the fever or the start of something worse? Will the 2020s be a decade of relative domestic tranquility or of discord, unrest, and a rending of the social fabric? And I think our history sort of in some ways is an exception in human history. American history is anomalous in human history. Normally, going back thousands of years, tribalism rules. Might makes right. And we are this, very recent experiment, and we are still a work in progress toward a more perfect union. And so we don't know whether this experiment will continue to work or not. And I think more immediately, more prosaically, but importantly, the success of the Biden administration will have a lot to do with whether things go well or not. If Joe Biden can deliver on some of these promises, and in a sense, fulfill some of what people thought was at stake the last time, that their standard of living isn't getting better, and that they feel that our institutions are not serving them. If Biden can be a Franklin Roosevelt, and we'll talk about this in some measure, then things will go much better. So I'm in some ways quite hopeful, because I think his odds are improving through this dark time.
Well, thank you. So there's the stakes of what we can learn from history matter a lot, as we all understand. And I want to start by turning back the clock first to 1861. Ted, that was in many ways the most fraught presidential transition we ever had. What was Lincoln facing as soon as he learned he was president?
He had an overwhelming litany of problems, ranging from, the most serious was 7 states, beginning with South Carolina, seceded from the country. It wasn't a case like now of accusing him of fraudulently winning. They just didn't want to be in a country that he was the president of at all. So South Carolina, which was the most extreme, seceded 6 weeks after he won in early November 1860. And he was followed by 6 other states in the Deep South. So the existential crisis he was facing was he only had half a country to be the president of. But then there were dozens of other problems, including the difficulty of even making it to Washington, D.C. That's the heart of the book I wrote, is that he had a long train trip. And I hadn't fully understood it, even though I'd read a lot of books about Lincoln. And the more I looked into it, the passage on the train is a kind of rite of passage in which he's winning back support. He's not a very strong president-elect. He's won less than 40%. Actually, it was surprising to me to learn that Lincoln, who is so famous and beloved, actually won with the second smallest percentage of the vote in our history, working down from upstate New York back into Pennsylvania. He does a good job improvising on the road. And so Lincoln displayed a new kind of presidential speaking that hadn't really been done before. But as you and I know, as fellow former speechwriters, presidents are basically always politicking. And he showed that it was possible to shore up his position pretty effectively by giving informal speeches and formal ones along the route. And increasingly, as he got closer to Washington, well, there was this exciting drama for me that his life is in danger. There was a more serious plot to kill him than I had understood before doing the research into this book. But paradoxically, he's finding ever more beautiful words to defend democracy, and he's locating them. We have a lot of founding documents and a lot of founders. So that's one of the interesting things you can look at with each president. What do they consider the beginning of American history? And for Lincoln, it was overwhelmingly the Declaration of Independence and the second paragraph about the human rights that are available. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And Lincoln, by repeating that over and over again, and especially the word all men are created equal, he's really returning a sense of human rights to the forefront of a political conversation that had become pretty degraded in the 1840s and 1850s as the United States won a lot of territory from Mexico in a somewhat dubious war, and then had very bitter arguments about what to do with all that land and whether slavery should be permitted to expand into it or not. And as that angry argument was going on, the whole idea of human rights was really receding pretty far into the background. So Lincoln, he doesn't use the phrase human rights. That's a important modern phrase, and John will tell us about that in the context of Jimmy Carter. But Lincoln was really making democracy better again, and had a very deep understanding going back to the Declaration of where it all came from.
And we didn't have polls then, of course, and in both Lincoln's case and Roosevelt's case, the inauguration was not until March 4th. God help us if this inauguration were not until March 4th this year. But do you get a sense from what you saw with the dozens of speeches that he gave that he was actually beginning to change people's minds about the expansion of slavery, about slavery itself, about the role of the presidency, and about the South as it was seceding?
He didn't talk a whole lot about slavery on the, I mean, he did and he didn't. He talked about his incoming administration and wanting to include all Americans in his first inaugural address, which is very important. You know, one of the great Lincoln speeches, one of the great speeches in all of our history, talks about uniting the country. We must not be enemies, we must be friends. And the memories that unite Americans, especially if they are touched by the famous better angels of our nature. But he was soft pedaling the most bitter problems as he came through on the train. He was trying to speak to those better angels, which was a more effective way of uniting people behind him. And in his first inaugural, even though there is, you know, a lot of beautiful language, there are a couple passages that read less well today, including his promise to the Southern states, which was basically an attempt to keep them from seceding, that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. And in fact, a 13th Amendment had been proposed that was the opposite of the 13th Amendment that we now know that banned slavery. A 13th Amendment was under consideration that would have permanently protected slavery where it existed. And Lincoln, in the first inaugural, says that he's okay with it. He obviously didn't like it, but for the sake of keeping the South and the North together in one country, he was willing to accept it. So he's really walking on a tightrope in these weeks. And as you said, there were too many weeks. That was a real flaw in the system that nobody could have anticipated when the Constitution was being written, but it was just too many weeks, the way we've seen in recent weeks now, between an election and an inauguration. There's a lot of time for things to go south in every sense of the phrase. And Lincoln would have probably been better off if he could have just come in 2 or 3 weeks after winning, because it took 6 weeks for secession to happen. Lincoln's also dealing with a crisis that we don't remember as well, but things were really squirrely inside the Buchanan White House, with Southern cabinet members guilty of all kinds of forms of corruption, sending huge shipments of guns down into the South and embezzling money. And there's a feeling that I had in my research that the Confederacy is already controlling Washington even before they start the Confederacy. So Lincoln almost has to take Washington before he can become president.
And as we know, he had to sneak in basically because of threats to his life and come into Washington in disguise. Thank you, Ted. And as we all know too, by the second inaugural, it was a transformed Lincoln as well as a transformed country. He spoke about the war as God's punishment of this country for the sin of slavery, and spoke to an audience that was about significantly African American.
That's right.
Many of them in uniform.
Right.
What a change that was.
Yep.
John, thanks, Ted. John Alter, we know some things about the 1932 transition, and you also have things to teach us about the Reagan-Carter transition. But the 1932 transition to 33 was fraught. It was not militarily fraught, but the country was also on the verge of not making it, as you've written.
Yeah, this was to that point the most perilous transition because yes, well, at least since the Civil War, and when Roosevelt was inaugurated, there were more troops on the streets of Washington than at any time since the Civil War, and I think this year's inauguration, there are more troops on the streets of Washington than at any time since 1933. The nation was really on edge. After the election, the economy kept slipping lower and lower, and the stock market was down 75% from 1929, and 25% unemployment. Although because women were not really counted as part of the workforce, if you did, it was really closer to 50% unemployment. There were socialists, communists, fascists who thought that they were actually relatively quiet in this period because they thought that the system was collapsing and that they would then be able to step in when it failed. And Roosevelt, not long after he became president, somebody came to him and said, if you succeed, Mr. President, you'll be our greatest president. If you fail, you'll be our worst president. And he said, no, if I fail, I'll be our last president. And so the stakes were really quite high. A lot of people wanted Roosevelt to be a dictator. Studebaker had a car called the Dictator that sold pretty well. The New York Daily News, which was the largest newspaper in the country, had a headline, "Wanted a Dictator." Walter Lippmann, who was the most prestigious columnist arguably of the 20th century, went to Roosevelt and said, you may have to assume a mild form of dictatorship. And I found in the files at Hyde Park at the Roosevelt Library a draft of a speech that Roosevelt was scheduled to deliver to the American Legion on the radio on his second day in office, in which he said to these aging veterans, men, World War I veterans in their 30s, 40s, you are at my disposal for the duration of the crisis. And Mussolini, who had black shirts, he was very popular in the United States at that time. Hitler was just coming in. But Roosevelt didn't give that speech. And instead, he just gave a version of his famous inaugural where he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he kind of restated a lot of the inaugural in that speech and decided not to take extra constitutional powers upon becoming president. Why was it so dire? Because the banking system was collapsing. And Roosevelt and Hoover were squabbling on the day before the inauguration over whether Hoover would close the banks. And Hoover wanted Roosevelt to have a joint proclamation. And Roosevelt's attitude was, Eleanor overheard them basically screaming at each other, no, God damn it, you close the banks or I'll do it myself when I'm president. He didn't want Hoover to draw him in to this failure. Hoover blamed Roosevelt unfairly for the banking crisis, which really originated in Michigan, had to do with Henry Ford and Edsel Ford and a whole other story. But there was really bad blood. And on the way down Pennsylvania Avenue, they were wordless except when they passed the construction of the new Department of Commerce. Hoover had been Secretary of Commerce. And Roosevelt said, "Nice steel." And those are the only words that they exchanged all the way down Pennsylvania Avenue. But at least Hoover showed up. When Hoover wouldn't wave to the crowd, they were in an open car. Roosevelt did and started waving and smiling. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Is actually a bit of inspired nonsense, because when you're trying to put food on the table, you have real things to fear. roof over your head. These are not, some sort of hypothetical problem. But he understood that this was partly a psychological problem and that the United States was kind of curled up in the fetal position. And so this was a conjuring act, inspiring confidence, and basically saying, if I can walk, people knew he was lame, but thought that he could walk from his polio because they never saw him in a wheelchair, and he would come to the podium with his sons or bodyguard kind of pushing him forward. And the impression was, if I can walk, if I can stand up and walk, America can stand up and walk too. But actually, the most important part of the inaugural was on 5 occasions, he used the word action. We need action, and action now. And he understood that talk was not enough and that he had to introduce a very ambitious program, get it through Congress, to give the country the idea that there was a sharp break from the past and that voluntarism to solve poverty was no longer enough, and we needed law and new programs to do so.
And of course, we don't remember this, but there was also violence in the area. It was an assassination attempt that he courageously lived through, and that gave him also a jolt of public attention and a new sense of who he was as president.
Right. Just to fill people in very briefly on what happened. So in February, Roosevelt went on Vincent Astor's yacht for a little vacation. And when he got off the yacht in Miami and was propped up on the back of his convertible, giving a very short speech, Giuseppe Zangara got off 5 shots from 25 feet away, and a woman jostled the gunman, and he ended up missing Roosevelt, but shooting and killing the mayor of Chicago, who was there to talk to Roosevelt because Chicago was completely bankrupt and they had laid off all their teachers and they couldn't pay anybody. And the country was basically bankrupt. So because he escaped assassination, that gave him extra stature. When he was elected, he was just the anti-Hoover. He was nominated on the 4th ballot. Even a lot of Democrats didn't like him. He was seen as a lightweight. And in that sense, a lot in common with Joe Biden, both ennobled by suffering, seen as lightweights. Even a couple days after he was sworn in as president, he went to Oliver Wendell Holmes's 92nd birthday party. And after he left, Holmes famously said, "Second-class intellect, first-class temperament." And I think the same applies to Joe Biden. And temperament is extraordinarily important. And that's a temperament of, in Roosevelt's case, hope, action, self-respect. That's what he was trying to convey. In Biden's case, it's hope, action, decency. So the parallels are very, very stark.
Thank you, John. Donna, you have talked about and written about your own experience of several presidential inaugurals, and I was wondering if you could share that and also how that all leads up to what you think the stakes are right now, and we can turn to what Biden ought to do at this moment. You're muted, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. And I was thinking back and really appreciating both Ted and Jonathan. They are true historians of our time. And so I've experienced a little history, but I'm no historian. But I think I can think back both to the times of living in the Washington region, and those of us who live here have experienced lots of inaugurations if we've been here for a while, on the streets and parades, listening to the speeches, and experiencing the transitions, which mostly have occurred, at least in my lifetime, with very little drama. Except that I will say that thinking back to 4 years ago and the transition between Obama and Trump, we might have anticipated that we would have this kind of transition should Donald Trump have lost the election. We didn't anticipate, of course, the violence, but we should have anticipated the antipathy. And then I look back to the Obama transition with Bush, and I had come into Congress right at that time. And it was also at a time where the economy was in free fall. And it required a lot of cooperation from that time period of the November election to the January inauguration between Obama and Bush. I can remember as a member of Congress, teams coming to the Capitol that were Obama transition and Bush administration together, trying to push us as a Congress to act on the economy. That would be, it's much in some ways like what we're experiencing with this transition and trying to deal with COVID, where there is very little, if any, real cooperation. And if we imagine that that had happened between Obama and Bush, our entire economy could have and would have fallen apart. And so when I fast forward to where we are now, I think about, being on that platform so close and seeing every level of government, our diplomatic corps are represented on that stage. That is exactly what we will not see in this inaugural for reasons of the pandemic, but also because, and having the previous administration represented on that platform, having people who had, disagreed with Obama and didn't support him in the election, but who showed up at the inauguration. We will not see that now, and we haven't seen that during this transition period. When Jonathan talks about, the kind of economic crises that was faced between Hoover to FDR, I don't imagine that given the crises that we are in right now, that because we've had this very unsuccessful transition, the transfer is going to happen, but it hasn't been peaceful by any stretch. And it is likely that Biden, I think, is going to face, multiple challenges that have to do with getting into and undoing things that they're not even aware of, precisely because they haven't had the kind of communication that's been necessary for a successful transition at a really difficult time. And so, looking at even the last, sort of 30, 40 years of presidential transitions, I think in our history, we will mark this one, and people like Ted and Jonathan will be writing about it because it is different. It is not normal, and it could, endanger our definition of what it means to transfer power for the future.
Thank you. And I should remind our audience that we're in about 5 minutes, we're going to turn to questions from all of you. But I still get to ask some myself. And I want to ask you, Donna, you've given a lot of speeches in your career. A challenge as we turn toward what President-elect Biden, or then he will be President Biden, ought to do in his inaugural. One of the things that's a standard, it's almost part of the ritual of a presidential inaugural, is for the president to call for unity, starting with Thomas Jefferson's inaugural after the very bitter election of 1800, which was called the Revolution of 1800. And John Adams stalked out of town and wouldn't stay for the inaugural. And he got up using the names of the two political parties of the time and said, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. But this is such a tough moment to embrace the notion of unity in that way. We all saw the searing image of these insurrectionists carrying the Confederate flag into the Capitol where you served, getting a lot further with it than Robert E. Lee ever did, in a sense. How can we expect, what do we think makes sense for Biden at a time of racial division, at a time of tribalism, and of what we have? How do we unsee, in a sense, what we've seen over the last few weeks?
Well, I think if you analyze where the speeches that President-elect Biden has been making over these last several weeks, they have been very measured. They've been when I think it was TED Talks about temperament, that Joe Biden's temperament could not be more matched for this moment, and people feel that. And in some ways, I think America is yearning for that, given the chaos of the last, not just several weeks, but really the last 4 years, from American carnage to actual carnage on the Capitol. And I think that, Biden will continue to call for unity among Americans. He won't necessarily be able to point to leaders, to named leaders who actually have in some ways participated, egged on, and enabled where we are now, but he will be able to call for unity among Americans. And I think that the vast majority of Americans are ready for that message. They're ready for competence, they're ready for calm, and they're ready to get down to the business of governing. And I think that that is where Joe Biden will land his speech on Inauguration Day.
Thank you, Ted. You, as you mentioned, and I both are former speechwriters. That's one of those professions where I'm not sure you're ever actually former. What do you think Biden should do in his inaugural?
Well, I mentioned Better Angels, and it's a bit of a cliche, but it's also a beautiful message from Lincoln's first inaugural. And so to go high in Michelle Obama's phrase and unite everybody to say things that will please the red states. And, as we know, there are different kinds of Americans actually in every state, but to take the high road and get everyone back in the same country. But at the same time, I think there are clear markers he should put down about the ways in which we really lost ourselves over the last few years. And one should be the acceptance of elections. So if he loses in the future, he should accept that. The telling of the truth, very important from our political leaders. And the rebuilding of what we often call civil society. Paradoxically, we use that phrase when we're talking about foreign countries. So we want to build up civil society in our foreign policy, and that usually means support for opposition parties and journalism and NGOs, and for women leaders as well as male leaders. And I think he needs to reassert that isn't negotiable. We have to have tolerance for different perspectives to be the United States of America. We have to bring back the human rights at the heart of the Declaration of Independence for all people.
And John, the inaugural is only the first thing, and not always the thing that's most listened to that a new president does. What do you think Biden should do, and the Biden-Harris administration should do right off the bat?
Well, we found out yesterday they have this $1.9 trillion, it's called the American Rescue Plan. And like Roosevelt, they're starting out with rescue and then moving to recovery and then reform. And you need all three. So I think they're off on the right foot. But I think what Ted and Donna said about the inaugural was spot on. It's really important to set that tone at the start, and especially to return us to the kingdom of fact and truth. You cannot have a democracy, a functioning democracy, without some agreement on the truth and on basic facts. And this is a long-term project. It requires more civics. It requires, an examination of our siloed media system. But that conversation has to start. I think it has started, fortunately, but the president can advance that. Then, after he takes office, in that first 100 days, I think framing is hugely important. So I see Build Back Better, Triple B, BBB, whatever you want to call it, as being comparable to the New Deal. It's a frame, shorthand that people can understand and connect to. In 2022, people aren't going to say, well, I like that 350 billion they had for state and local government, and I like what they did where they funded the WIC program, and I didn't like this other thing so much. That's not the way voters think. They either are for BBB or they're against it, and Democrats have had this real trouble. Both Carter and Clinton rolled out this notion of the new foundation, which I thought was actually not a bad slogan. It wasn't as good as Build Back Better, but it was good. It's just Democrats think repeating slogans is boring, so they wouldn't do it. And both Carter and Clinton repudiated the new foundation within days of when they said it in important speeches. I think they both said it in State of the Union speeches. And you know this better than anybody, you guys. And so they must stick with BBB, slap it on everything, so that you just can't get away from it, and it becomes the shorthand for the Biden administration. But I think we found out in recent days there needs to be other shorthand, and that is the big lie. So the Democrats have to repeat until they're blue in the face that we've just been subjected to the big lie, and they have to get Americans debating all over the country. Hey, there were 60 court cases. It was a big lie. It can't be, well, they should have voted for certification of the election, and you get down into the weeds on it. Just, it was a big lie. We are going to convince you in a bunch of different fora that it was a big lie. Until that is accepted by a majority of the American people, we will never have a safe election again. Imagine what happens the next time when the election's close, and maybe when there is some fraud. If we aren't inoculated by 2020, we're in big trouble. The election will just be litigated. The losers will judge shop, and we could have what we narrowly escaped, which is a coup d'etat, essentially, that overturns a legitimate election.
And Donna Edwards, you of course have faced voters, and one of the extraordinary things about this moment, this fraught moment, was that up until now we haven't even mentioned the fact that the president was impeached this week. And if I had gone back in a time machine to you maybe 10 days ago and told you that would happen, you might not have believed your visitor from the future. What impact on the public and on the voters on these core issues of our democracy do you think these events will have, and how do we get people talking and thinking about these things the way we might want them to, when there are so many other things in their lives and challenges that they face?
Well, I mean, first of all, you can never expect Americans who are faced with a pandemic that touched almost all of us around the country, and they're faced with economic uncertainty, not able to put food on the table. They're never going to put those things ahead of, or put democracy issues ahead of that. On the other hand, I think that all of us were witnesses to what happened. It's not like this is some, dark corner of a phone call and a transcript. All of us were witnesses to that. And I think you can see that even in the early polling, where the majority of Americans actually do believe that the president committed impeachable offenses and should be removed as president. And even though that removal can't come, the judgment is going to come if the Senate decides to convict. I think the biggest challenge is going to be, how do you balance both moving forward a legitimate impeachment trial and the need to get on with governance? And I think it's possible to do that. We'll see new leadership in the Senate in Chuck Schumer, and I think that will actually allow Congress to do the things that we talk about, like walk and chew gum at the same time. But this is going to be a real challenge. Look, I remember when we passed that $700 billion bailout program, there are voters today who are still angry about that. I mean, so this notion that somehow voters they may not remember the details, but they actually do remember things. And so we're going to have to make sure that what they remember out of this is that our democracy was threatened, and that we have a lot of work to do to make sure that it never happens again.
And, thank you. And I should note that question about impeachment was a question from the audience, and we do encourage you to share more questions. John Alter, a question from the audience is about the Reagan to Carter transition, which was not quite as violent and scarifying in some ways as what we're living through now, or some of the others, but where there are some interesting lessons to be learned. And the question is, what do you draw from that transition?
Well, you can see I'm still amid my my book tour. So that was a very dramatic transition because there was hope that the hostages would come back. Carter had, the hostages were seized in Iran exactly 1 year to the day before Election Day, 1980. But after Election Day came and went, Reagan was elected. Whether his people did something to delay the release of the hostages until after the election is a question that I grapple with without going down the rabbit hole. But then Carter still has the challenge of getting them out, because this is something Carter really cared about, bringing them home safely. Arguably, he cared too much so that it overshadowed the rest of his presidency. And he began through the Algerians a very complicated effort to try to get the hostages released. And he actually spent the night before the inauguration just catching less than 2 hours sleep on the couch in the Oval Office, because they were amid very complex negotiations that involved releasing frozen Iranian assets. And he, at one point early in the morning, he calls Reagan to give an update that the hostages are just about to be released. And Ed Meese, says, no, don't wake up the president-elect. And then, a couple hours later, maybe at 7 a.m., he's got a whole crowd of aides in the Oval Office where they're running this from. He finally gets in touch with Reagan, and afterwards he says to his staff, I gave him an update on the hostages, and Reagan said, "What hostages?" And everybody burst into laughter. But they still thought that they would be released before Reagan was sworn in. And so Reagan comes to the White House. They go down Pennsylvania Avenue, and Carter is on the phone, for much of the ride, trying to get an update. Has the plane taken off? And the Iranian government didn't want the plane to take off while Carter was still president, but they didn't know that. And Reagan, meanwhile, is telling a Hollywood story. And when they get out of the limo at the Capitol, Carter says to an aide, "Who is Jack Warner?" And that's where Reagan's mind was. And then, the inaugural, they're on the inaugural platform, and an aide comes and passes word. Reagan is sworn in at noon. When he's giving his inaugural address, an aide comes and tells Carter, they've left Iranian airspace. The hostages are free. And Carter, even though he was arguably humiliated, he was really happy that they were coming home alive. And then Reagan, to his credit, says to Carter, gestures to Carter at the beginning of his inaugural address, "I want to thank President Carter for this smooth transition, which was so much in the interest of the American people." And it was similar to what Carter had said to Gerald Ford, who he had defeated, and Ford in a much closer election in 1976, a really close election, conceded early the next morning. And he and Carter had such a smooth transition in 76, 77 that they became good friends. And Carter, in his inaugural address, the very first thing he said is, "I want to thank President Ford for helping to heal our land." And so there was a different tradition. And you know, Ted talked about these norms. These were the norms that we had going back to 1800, where, yes, Adams didn't attend the inaugural, but he set a precedent that we've had until this year of a peaceful transfer of power. And, you know, and he did not try to say that he won the election. So what Trump did was so injurious to our system, even setting aside the insurrection at the Capitol last week. Just the fact that he has not conceded the election is terribly damaging. And we need to have some sort of accountability, that I argue goes beyond impeachment in the days ahead. And the idea of
you mean accountability for those who were part of the insurrection, but those members of Congress who spewed the same lies that spurred the insurrection, or who even conspired with them.
Yes, we now have one of the insurrectionists on tape saying that Congressman Mo Brooks, Congressman Andy Biggs were part of it. Now, they can't be expelled from Congress based on the word of an insurrectionist who Stephen Colbert calls Sammy Davis Hitler. But it's good that there is this thorough investigation, and it would not surprise me if this ended with one or more expulsions from Congress.
I'll give each of you a chance to add to that, and then we need to wrap up. Donna, what do you think about accountability as well as unity?
Right. Well, I don't think that you can have unity without having accountability. I believe that. I mean, I think that there, as Jonathan described, these norms that have been broken are so injurious to the republic, and you can't have people running around the House and the Senate who were like part of the deal. And some of that is going to come through an ethics process. Other, I think, is going to come through law enforcement investigation. But there must be accountability. I remember taking that oath of office, and you think about every single word and your obligation to the Constitution and the people of the United States of America, and that has been broken. And the only way to repair it is to make sure that people pay the price for the injury that they've done to the republic.
And Ted, finally, you have written and said that you thought that 2020 was one of the three worst years in the history of the country. 1861, the breakup and the secession by the Confederacy and the beginning of the Civil War, and 1929 being the other one you mentioned. How do we make 2021 and going forward a better remembered time as future historians will look at it?
Well, I hate to keep using cliches, but that's what happens to old speechwriters like you and me. And it is it's a teachable moment. So we came really close to a disaster last week, but we did not succumb. And I was very moved and very impressed that Congress came back so quickly that very night and got something important done. So there is momentum in the right direction. And we've seen impressive actions by funders of Donald Trump who've pulled back their funding, and Silicon Valley, who's, we're just seeing a lot of new things in just the last 7 days. And if we can continue in that spirit and not just relapse into there were so many problems in our politics, it wasn't just Donald Trump. And if we can start to have better regulated funding of elections, and if we can teach, the word civics was used earlier in this conversation. I can't remember if it was you or Donna or John, but I really believe in returning to teaching democracy. I think we've taken it for granted that we all understand it. And I think, it is something we need to study a bit more. And civics has a little bit of a connotation of a boring 1950s approach, but in fact, it can be made exciting again. And we need everybody. We need musicians and artists and professors of history and professors of many other disciplines to think about how to teach who we are back again to Americans, and because we lost a step over the last 4 years, and I think we'd been losing in some ways before that too. So we really need to take stock. We have a magnificent history, and if we can go back into those moments that we are proud of and create a foundation for teaching civics again, I think that would be a wonderful outcome.
Well, let us all hope, however we feel about the new administration, that this can be a time of shaking us awake, of recommitting, a teachable moment, as you say, and the turn towards something better for the country. I want to thank our panelists, who I could certainly hear from for another 2 or 3 hours. We have a lot to chew on. Jonathan Alter, Donna Edwards, and Ted Widmer. It's been really, really important discussion, and I want to thank you. And I have a quick note from the Brennan Center before we leave. We do encourage you, as we are part of this fight for American democracy and our Constitution and our system of equal justice, to stay in touch with us. Please sign up for our newsletters. The briefing, which is our weekly newsletter, in particular, might be of great interest. And you can do that at brennancenter.org. I want to thank my colleagues who staged this event and who've made these Zoom events such a great part of the Brennan Center's life, and also part of the teaching function that I hope we can help do for the whole country. I want to thank all of you for being here and all of you for the questions you had. Let's all stay militantly committed to these values of our Constitution, our sense of equality and democracy, and the country we all love. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.